The Transportation and Public Works Committee this day, March 5th, 2019. I'm Councilor Reich. I chair the committee, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Councilmembers Palmisano, Bender, Fletcher, and Gordon. We are a quorum and will proceed with today's agenda. I will note that CM Johnson isn't here due to a family emergency conflict. However, I know item 2 is very important to his ward. He's been following it very closely, and I believe his staff is here as well in the back for any constituent conversation that you want to do today. And so with that, I'll go through all 14 items, starting with the consent items. Any council member can pull them for further consideration. Item 3 is the first consent item, and that's a PV Plaza ordinance. And that'll be setting a public hearing for that matter March 19th. Item 4 is the 10th Avenue Bridge Tunnel Water Main Project, and it's a bond amendment and appropriation. The amounts are listed. Item 5 is the 14th Avenue Northeast Alley construction project legislation. Cost estimate and setting that public hearing for April 23rd. Item 6 is the ASPN College Game Day Block E event for the date listed. Item 7 is the areaway abandonment for 3032 and 3038 Hennepin Avenue South, designating the project cost estimates, and that public hearing will be held on May 7th. Item 8 is the bid for the ready-mix concrete. 9 is the bid for bituminous mixtures. 10 is the bid for the Fridley Softening Plant 2019 masonry repair project. Item 11 is the bid for the 8th Street reconstruction project. 12 is the bid for the 10th Avenue Water Main River Crossing project. And 13 is the bid for the Hennepin Avenue sanitary sewer replacement project. Does any council member wish to pull an item? Seeing none, I'll move all items as submitted. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Dissenting name. That carries, and we can now go to the public hearing, starting with public hearing number 1, the Grand Street Northeast Street Resurfacing. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Mike Kennedy has both of the public hearings this morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Kennedy.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm here for the public hearing for the Grand Street Northeast Resurfacing Project. On January 18th, 2019, the City Council designated the location, streets, and improvements proposed to be made in the 2019 Street Resurfacing Program. The Grand Street Northeast is one of those projects within the program. Grand Street Northeast is an MSA or local street from Lowry Avenue Northeast to 31st Avenue Northeast. The MSA segment of Grand Street is from Lowry to 30th and was reconstructed in 1963. Has a current PCI of 58. The segment of Grand Street from 30th Avenue to 31st is a local portion and was reconstructed in 1963 with a PCI of 60. The project also represents an opportunity to add pedestrian bump out at the corner of 29th Avenue Northeast, which is adjacent to assisted living facility. The bump out will significantly reduce crossing distances, simplify crossings for people walking, and improve access for the transit stop. The proposed street resurfacing special assessments were determined by applying the 2019 uniform assessment rates at the rate of 66 per square foot for non-residential and 22 cents per square foot for residential properties. There was a neighborhood meeting held and a few people that attended. Today, therefore, we're recommending passage of a resolution ordering the work to proceed and adopting special assessments in the amount of $173,807.45 for this project, and passage of a resolution requesting the Board of Estimate and Taxation authorize the city's issuance and sale of assessment bonds in said amount. That's my presentation. If there are other questions, we can take those too.
Are there any questions per the staff presentation? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing. Anyone signed in? No one signed in. Does anyone wish to come forward and speak to this matter? Anyone wish to come forward? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and move the item as submitted. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting name. That carries, and we can now go to public hearing number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Mike Kennedy from the Transportation Maintenance and Repair Division of Public Works. This is the public hearing for the Sanford area residential street resurfacing project. Again, on January 18th, the council designated the locations and streets of the resurfacing project for their program for this year, and this project was part of that. Sanford is a number of local streets in the Howe, Longfell, and Seward neighborhood areas, as shown on the map that accompanies the letter, the RCA. I won't go through all the details of it. You can see the project on the map, but it includes a neighborhood plus several MSA streets. The overall PCI ranges from something like 43 to 56 within the project areas, which puts it squarely in the PCI range where this kind of work is appropriate. The resurfacing program costs of $7,431,263 as part of this. The project has $1,836,806 in proposed special assessments. The proposed street resurfacing special assessments, again, were determined by applying the 2019 uniform assessment rates of 66 cents per square foot for non-residential and 22 cents per square foot for residential. So, again, today we recommend passage of a resolution ordering the work to proceed and adopting special assessments in the amount of $1,836,146.73 for this project, and passage of a resolution requesting the Board of Estimate and Taxation authorize the city's issuance and sale of assessment bonds in the amount stated. Again, that's my presentation. We can stand for questions. I understand there are some letters of objection and people may want to speak.
Thank you. Any questions per the staff presentation? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing. I do have someone who signed in. We'll begin with that. Robin Brahms, please come forward, state your name and address for the record.
Hello, my name is Robin Brahms, and I reside at 3236 31st Avenue South, which is in this proposed resurfacing project. And I am here to oppose not the project, because I know the street needs to be resurfaced. However, I am strictly opposed to the method of assessment. And I have given all of you a letter that was written by me, because the assessment is somehow based on a pyramid system that is ancient, and we are in the 21st century. I do not understand why properties are assessed by square foot. I had a neighbor at 3129 29th Avenue South who lived there for 50 years till she was 89 or 90 years old. In that 50 years, she never drove an automobile, but she had a huge lot, almost a double lot. So imagine what she would pay for a street resurfacing. It's simply unfair. Everyone uses the city streets, everyone. And therefore, every property that is taxable, every taxable entity should be taxed on an equitable basis. The pyramid system has not worked, and it is continually used. I don't know why it's never been investigated and looked at for its bias and unfairness and how it penalizes and is punitive to people who live on major thoroughfares. So, for example, a recent resurfacing and redo of Minnehaha Avenue, and the residents there and the property owners there were assessed as extremely. And some years ago, Lyndale Avenue was done, and I would believe that people along and around that were also extremely assessed. Whereas in our neighborhood, as this letter states, 20 years ago I was told, using the pyramid system, that since my home was towards the middle of the block and I paid so much more, hundreds of dollars more, that it would work out. And when they paved the east-west streets, there would be a reverse assessment, and the homes that were inner would pay the lesser amount, and the outer ones at the corners would pay more, except that the east-west streets were never paved. The east-west streets are almost never paved. They're just not used that much. So on the map, you will notice the north-south streets, and 35th is there, which is a heavily used street, but 31st Street, 32nd, 33rd, 34th are not on there, and they were not on there 20 years ago. They were not done. So this pyramid system has not reversed itself, and it unfairly, unjustly penalizes myself and other property owners. And I have a proposal in here that says that we need to go back to the beginning. I think the engineer said that the street repaving project started in the 60s, maybe 65. I don't know when the assessment started. I don't know when this pyramid system started. I haven't had time to research it. But we need to go back. We need to compare properties and see who has been assessed and who hasn't been assessed. And we need to equalize this. We need to take the homes that have been overassessed and give them some redress, and take the properties, whatever property it is, home or whatever, that have not been assessed. Some of them in 30 years or more have not been assessed, and distribute this assessment equally. So I am standing here opposing the assessment and asking it not to be approved today. We are in the 21st century, and we really should be able to do better for the citizens of Minneapolis than what we see with this archaic, preposterous system. The project I am not objecting to. I am objecting to the assessment, and would ask that until the City Council, working with the streets and transportation people, can come up with an equitable system of assessment, that the assessment should not be passed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation and comments. Anyone sign in since? Anyone wish to come forward and make comment on this project? Anyone, please come forward and state your name and address for the record.
My name is Larry Christian. I live at 3524 34th Avenue South. I was not able to make last week's meeting because I have a grandson who lives next door to me who is unfortunately sick. Will I be able to ask a few questions of you today?
You can certainly make statements and ask questions, and staff might be able to answer.
Okay. One of them is who is doing the work, the city, or is it going to be subcontracted?
I usually take questions at the very end. So
Oh, okay. Okay. Then I guess I'm going to oppose, or I'm going to say the same thing as that lady who was just up here. I'm going to object to it also because I have a friend who lives on 28th Street, right across the street from her, a lot the same size, although she's listed as a double lot. She is being assessed $900 more than him, and some archaic system says she should be charged more than him because she has a double lot, but they're not doing where the second lot is on 30th Avenue. They're just doing 28th Street, and there's no reason she'd be charged almost $1,000 more. And then I guess the only other question that I would have is they're just doing a 2-inch overlay. Are we going to be charged when I'm 90 years old, maybe 5 times this, so you can do the proper thing that should be done here? Because I'm an old retired guy, and my taxes, I pay taxes, and now I'm being assessed for something that it just doesn't seem right. But now I'm wondering, because it's just a cheap overlay, am I going to be billed the same thing again when I'm so old I can't even afford to eat without a straw?
Thank you for your comments. Anyone else wish to come forward and make a statement? Anyone else wish to come forward? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and ask Mr. Kennedy to speak to our, as it's purported to be, archaic pyramid system, which we actually have a different name for it, and then also the notion about contracting and durability of the treatment.
Yep. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm not sure what is meant by the pyramid system. The system we use is a uniform assessment rate, where we essentially it's a uniform assessment rate and an influence area method to apply it. Our uniform assessment rate is calculated every year based upon an estimate from the previous years of the cost of the work, and applied then in a formula to create that uniform assessment rate so that each person, each property is assessed the same rate. The influence area then is what creates how that rate is applied and what the final cost amount would be. Corner lots typically, very often on the edge of the projects, will only have half of the influence area affect their lot, so that it will be less than the full influence. properties in the middle of the block, yes, they will pay the full influence area. They'll pay the full rate, area rate that's applied by the influence area on theirs. And then the ones on the side, on the corners, will pay less until the cross street then is paved, and then the exact same thing will happen. They'll pay half of that project, half the rate for that project, and then the properties on the middle of that block will pay the full rate. So this method has been in use for a number of years. It wasn't originally used when the residential paving program started back in the 60s, but it has come into being as a way to equally share the cost of these projects. So I'm not sure how else to answer that, other than this is a very long-term used program that most people feel is pretty effective and fair to apply to people. The second speaker, the question of who does the work. City forces do the work. Our paving construction group will do the work. It's all done by city forces. Part of the work is contracted out. Some of the milling is, we outsource some of that, but then the paving work and the concrete work for any curb and gutter work is done by our forces. The question about the neighbor of the double lot, yes, that is how the influence area works. It applies the same rate to the square foot that is influenced or affected, and so a double lot will have a larger final number applied to it, the final larger assessment rate.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon?
So just to clarify, because you were talking about the middle of the block, everybody on a block face except the two corner lots are paying the same rate based on the square footage of the lot?
That's exactly right, Councilmember Gordon.
And do you know what that is per square footage? I don't either.
Well, the uniform assessment rate is, as I said, 22 cents per square foot.
Thank you.
For the residential lots.
Right. Okay, so the fact that you're right in the middle doesn't mean you pay any more than the properties next to you until you get to the corner. Okay.
You pay the same rate, but the final
Right.
amount might be different based on the size
lot
of your
size.
property that is affected.
I understand that and appreciated that, and just wanted to make sure that that was clear. How long? Maybe you just said this, and I got distracted because I was trying to look up uniform assess rate. How long does the resurfacing last before we think we need to go back and resurface again or do a reconstruction? Do we say it could last 10 years, 30 years?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, we believe when we created this program back in 2008, the resurfacing program, our estimate was that we were going to be extending the life at least 10 years, probably more like 15 years by applying this type of work. We're now 11 years into the program, and we have found that that has seemed to be definitely true, that the streets that were done 10 years ago are in very good shape still. And we are not having to do a lot of pothole repair. The street department doesn't have to go back and do a lot of work. We have been doing some crack sealing and things like that to extend that life a little bit further. But that original 10 to 15 years seems to be borne out by our experience so far.
And to do a whole reconstruction proportionally, that's a lot more expensive than resurfacing. Is it 10 times more expensive? 50 times more? Do you have a rough estimate?
It's at least 10 times more expensive. It's very expensive. Also, the assessment rate, the uniform assessment rate for reconstruction is 4 times this rate of resurfacing. So if we ever do come back, and we will have to come back someday to do more work, and if that's a reconstruction, then the assessment rate will be much greater than this. What this does, we hope, is extend the life of the street out so that the need to come back and reconstruct is farther down the line.
I think I had one more question and then a comment. Do we have anything to assist people who may have a difficulty paying this assessment? Can we stretch it out more years if they appeal it? Is there room for some negotiation?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Gordon, there are ways for people with disabilities or over 65 who can apply for a deferment. And they can do that by contacting your office and then contacting our assessment office to apply for that deferment.
And the deferment would mean that they don't have to make any payments until the property sells?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, that's exactly correct.
Okay. So maybe, I don't know if that would, anybody would qualify with that. Then I just want to comment. This isn't the first time I've heard concerns about this unified assessment, and sometimes I've heard them coming from myself. It does strike me that this might not be the best policy because there might be a way to more fairly share the costs of maintaining our roads. I know that we've relied on it for a long time and it fills that gap. My understanding is we actually are paying for some of this resurfacing from the general property tax fund, in fact, the largest portion. So this is kind of filling a gap. I guess I did have one more question because I don't remember exactly. What percentage of the project are we paying for off of the uniform assessments?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, it depends. Generally speaking, very generally speaking, for reconstruction, the assessed rate is about 20-25%, more or less. It switches for the resurfacing just because of the mechanics of the math of it, that the assessments probably cover some 75% of the project costs, and then net debt bonds or MSA dollars would cover the rest.
So this pays more of it.
For the resurfacing program, yes.
And I've never attempted a staff direction to do this, but I would say that if we were going to look at how we do this assessment and improve it, I think it would be important that it was a thoughtful process, and it was a longer process, and it was outside of any decision about what's happening right now. So I appreciate that we're saying you should redo this and take another look at it. It's old, it doesn't make sense, it's not fair to people. And I could see, and I believe there are other cities that simply do their road resurfacing and reconstruction out of their general funds. They just pull in enough property tax revenue and other things so that they can pay for them without doing these assessments. We also do something pretty similar to this with our sidewalks. So what tends to happen is when you're in poorer areas of the city, people with fixed incomes, concentrations of that, it hits them pretty hard because they aren't necessarily able to pay more. And then if you're in other parts of the city where maybe it's people have more expendable income, they don't see this assessment as hitting them very hard, and it's just fine. So in that way, it might be seen by some of us who think about taxes as a more regressive tax, a way of doing this that's going to hit people who have less money much harder than people who have more money. Our property tax, of course, isn't necessarily a progressive tax either, so we don't have a lot of options. But I guess I throw that out kind of for my colleagues. Maybe there is a point in for staff. And maybe when we're looking at our transportation plan, we could call this out or something about how do we actually pay for these things, and should we take another look at it? And I'll just put a pin in that for us here. And I think someday we should at least review it and make sure it's the best that we can do.
Yeah, and I would suggest that would be based on perhaps the sort of analysis and historical sort of look that was suggested by one of the presenters too. So it would have that basis in reality. So appreciate that. Any further questions? Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't see people in the room that were part of this conversation except for you, Mr. Kennedy, and you, Chair Reich. But a few years ago, I do want to point out that with then Director and Deputy Director Steve Kotke and Heidi Hamilton, we did go through an exercise where we looked at what other cities were doing and how we might be more fair and more equitable from an assessment model. We did look at other models. For example, the city of Chicago doesn't have street assessments. They have a property tax, and then they fight and argue over where they put certain projects in any given year. And wards or aldermen are given certain ward budgets to make their own decisions based on their constituent feedback as to what needs the most attention and when. We have a very calculated model that looks at pavement condition index across the city and doesn't take political will as much into account as we do the condition of the road. I see Mr. Kennedy nodding, so I'll encourage you to help me fill in the gaps here, because this was about 3 years ago that we had this conversation, but we looked at models like Chicago and found that that really wasn't going to be the most fair way of doing things. We looked at ways that other parts of Minnesota, like smaller cities, suburbs of Minnesota, do this work, and we have found that over time they were moving to our type of assessment model because while certainly not perfect, they did find it to be the most fair. I also want to point out that heavier use streets get more heavily subsidized, in part because the material and the way that they're constructed is a little bit different. We have municipal state aid routes that get where that funding and thus that work has to be prioritized within all of the municipal state aid routes across our city. Legally speaking, there is considered to be a direct property benefit when there is a new street outside somebody's home. And that, while not perfect, and myself, I live on a double front lot, and that means a lot of road work over the years, that does improve the value of the property immediately adjacent. And so that is why, after looking at several different models just a few years ago, we landed on the idea that we would continue with this method of assessment. And I just wanted to point that out because I know that our guests that came this morning didn't know about that work effort, and that we really are looking at other ways to do this. It's not that we are just using this old archaic system, because we have throughout time. So thank you.
Thank you for that comment and reflection. Councilmember Gordon.
So it sounds like that may have occurred when I wasn't on the TPW. Was that a report to the committee then that you heard? So I wasn't on this committee last term.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean we can't continue our inquiry.
Right, and maybe I'll try to dig that up. I know we switched to LIMS, and sometimes it's hard to dig up things from the last term, but I appreciate if somebody maybe gets a moment and they could help me see that information, because that would be interesting.
Yeah, and it's certainly in the spirit of the department to always review and look at policies and take commentary to heart when we continue with policies, and we don't do it blindly. We do it with data and a sort of balanced sense of what's out there in terms of alternatives and making choices from that basis. Any further commentary or discussion? Very good discussion, actually. Obviously, we take this work very seriously. I will say I'll be moving to forward this to full council. Between now and the final formal decision at council, I encourage you to continue to working with the Ward 12 office with any particular needs you have through the constituent service model. And again, apologies from CM Johnson, who did have an emergency and conflict, but is fully engaged on this topic between now and the full council vote. With that, I will move the item before us. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries. We can now go to the final item on our agenda, which is a discussion item.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Josh Johnson will present the receive and file topic for our scooter operation for 2019.
Good morning.
Chair Wright, members of the committee, my name is Josh Johnson. I'm the Advanced Mobility Manager for Public Works. With that, I also oversaw the scooter pilot from last year, so what I'd like to bring to you today is a recap of that pilot and also some recommendations for going forward in 2019. To recap the timeline of events leading up to our pilots, we began on August 6th with 200 scooters total in the city. That was 100 each for both Bird and Lime, the two companies that operated shared scooters in the city. We approved an increase to that number in September, bumping that up to 300 scooters total, and that included some dedicated distribution to areas such as the Phillips neighborhood, Cedar Riverside, and near North. The intention was that if companies chose to take advantage of that increased number of scooters, they would also be placing those scooters in those required areas, and really to give us a better understanding of how scooters interacted in neighborhoods that were primarily low-income, non-white majority. The city also increased in October. That was a scheduled increase to 400 scooters total, 200 for each company. The University of Minnesota also introduced its own pilot in September. They started out with 100 scooters total, 50 for each company. That increased to 200 scooters total in October. And so at our peak operating in the city, we had up to 600 scooters. Going back to the U of M pilot, the intention there was that scooters distributed to campus in the morning could then be ridden and parked on city right-of-way throughout the day, picked up, and then redistributed to campus the following morning. And both pilots ended on November 30th. Before I dig in further, I do want to mention the importance of data to this pilot. So it provided the background for understanding and evaluating the 2018 scooter pilot, which was enabled through a strong collaboration with IT's data and analytics team. I'd like to particularly recognize three who are here today, Pam Health, Stacy Blaskowski, and Rick Paulson, who were integral in building the approach and the tools that we implemented for both monitoring and analysis of the pilot. So we use data and technology to develop tools for monitoring vendor compliance as well as historical analysis. As those tools were developed, we also established a method for ensuring privacy was protected. Throughout this work to implement our approach to data, we've collaborated with some national organizations such as Los Angeles DOT and the Open Transport Partnership, which has developed a platform called Shared Streets, who are leading the conversation nationally on mobility data and also privacy. And we've used them to benchmark our work. Through that, we've also developed our own capability, and it's become clear that we are one of the few cities who've been able to build these tools and implement this approach on the national scale and are now involved in organizations like NACTO, leading this work nationally and helping to build the conversation around mobility data. With that, I'd also like to go into a little bit of detail on the privacy methodology that was developed. So, as we mentioned previously, privacy protection was a crucial piece of developing this approach to data. The data analytics team implemented a method for anonymization of data so that raw data was not stored, and re-identification of someone's individual trips could not be established, but rather we created a model of each trip based on the reported trip details by accessing GPS coordinates and vehicle status reporting from the scooters themselves. And this allowed us to be able to build those compliance and analysis tools that we did. Again, following kind of the conversation about our broader approach to data, this has also been something we've been benchmarking with those national organizations and have been able to really position ourselves as leading in this area. To dig into a little bit of the specifics on our approach to privacy, so all data is processed and anonymized in memory, meaning essentially we establish a gateway where raw data comes in, we do our anonymization, the model of that data is stored, the raw data is then thrown away. The original trip IDs that are coming from the devices from the companies are discarded, and a new unique city trip ID is generated and attributed to that stored data. Trip times are also rounded to the nearest half hour on 15-minute increments. And so that would mean that if a trip started at 12:04 and ended at 12:23, the times would be rounded to 12 p.m. and 12:30 accordingly. The intention there was to ensure, again, that we're doing our part to obfuscate the data, ensuring that someone's individual trips could not be tracked. In addition to that, we've also aggregated the trip start and end points as well as the routing points throughout the trip itself to moving to the center line of the street. So based on where the trip coordinate was, either one side of the block or the other, it would be moved to the center line of the street, and then the start and end points would then be aggregated by either one side of the block or the other or the middle. The intention there, again, is to anonymize that trip to ensure that we still get good data like how it relates to transit, how it may relate to bike infrastructure or land use, but we are protecting the privacy of those individuals who are taking those trips. Moving into some of the tools that we were able to build with that approach to data. So we developed a dashboard intended to allow us ability to maintain compliance with the terms of the agreement. And so we established this compliance dashboard essentially to visualize the location of idle scooters, to help us understand how companies were complying with the cap number that we had set, and then also understand where scooters were distributed. What you see on the left is a heat map showing location of scooters, and that's aggregated as you zoomed out to hexagons essentially, but as you zoom in, you can get to specific locations of the individual scooters. On the right, that's a bar chart visualizing essentially the numbers and the intervals that we monitored the idle scooters. So green represents Lime, black blackish gray represents bird, and that gave us an understanding of how many scooters were sitting idle in the city at one point in time. Additional features we've been looking at for 2019 include integrating with 3-in-1 data, so we'd be able to overlay location and nature of complaints with this information to be able to establish some focus areas where we may see that based on feedback given through 3-in-1, we need to create some focus areas around parking or riding behavior. We could also establish alerts based on geofencing to understand how many scooters are in or out of a specified area where we may want to focus on whether it's broader distribution or maintaining compliance with parking and riding behavior. All of that has been kind of queued up as iterations for this dashboard for 2019. Moving into usage data, so we monitored data over the period July 10th through November 30th. Both companies did establish operations before the official pilot launched, but we were able to gain access to data for the full term that they were operational here. There were 225,543 total rides that equated to 1,566 rides per day. Companies reported 74,877 unique users. There may have been some overlap between the companies, so that number may be smaller in terms of the just individual number of unique users, but this is what the companies each reported to us. There were 302,326 total miles ridden. That represented 1.3 miles per ride. Two last things I'd like to point out on this slide. There was a high of 39 trips in one day on an individual scooter. And the map you see on the right is a heat map of the streets ridden that we were reported on from accessing the data from scooters. And that represents 92.7 of city streets and off-street bike trails that were ridden on by scooters. The heat map shows in blue a minimum of one ride on those street segments. As you move in towards the center of the city, white, yellow, green, and red represent a higher density of trips, and that generally follows the distribution of scooters. So primarily scooter companies distributed their scooters in the downtown and surrounding neighborhoods as well as around campus, and so that's where the majority of use occurred. I would just like to point out that despite that limited distribution, scooters made it all the way north, all the way south, and all the way east and west, and it's exciting to me to see that potential for much broader use and distribution.
We have a question from Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just a brief comment, and you can respond if you want, but the heat map is also basically our population density, and you could measure density of those areas in many ways, including population density or job density or destination density. So I think it's really important when we talk about reach and distribution to think about equity, and particularly race equity, but also to understand the underlying physical development pattern of our city, which is that we do not have an evenly distributed, density of people or jobs. And so this is basically the population density map of our city as well.
Chair Wright, Councilmember Bender. Generally, speaking from experience, I was previously the general manager of Car2Go. Shared mobility follows population density in terms of use, and so that's definitely true in this case, and I think broadly. We also established a survey which both companies distributed during the pilot, which yielded almost 1,000 responses. The survey included questions aimed at understanding user behavior and demographics. In analyzing responses to these questions, we found the following. 62% responded as users of using scooters multiple times per month, 19% of those multiple times per week. 69% responded that scooter availability, the lack of scooter availability, prevented them from using more often. 35% were non-users of bicycles, likely meaning they were new to the street, new to the bikeway network, and likely unfamiliar and less comfortable riding on the bikeway network. 42% of responses stated a decrease in the use of personal vehicles, TNCs, or taxis in having access to scooters. In describing their most recent trip, and this is describing the chart you see on the right, 95% selected that they were riding to an actual destination, not just riding for fun. And so what you see there is the flows in that graphic represent the density of trips that were reported in that survey question. And so you can see home to work, home to school, home to dining and fun, work to home, work to work, work to school, were a lot of the more popular destinations. All the way at the bottom on the right was riding for fun. And again, that follows the idea that 95% reporting on their most recent trip had an actual destination in mind. This shows that scooters were a meaningful transportation option, not just novelty, not just people riding on a whim. And 80% responded that they were either satisfied or very satisfied with scooter companies overall. Digging into the demographic side of the survey, 61% of respondents live in a Minneapolis zip code, 25% in a Greater Twin Cities zip code. 68% identified their gender as male, 88% as white. Average age of the respondents was 30, and 70% of respondents reported household income of $50,000 or greater. That shows us that we have a lot of work to do to make scooters equitable, and I think that's reflected in the recommendations that will follow. 19% of respondents reported household income of $25,000 or less. Of those, 76% responded as active or frequent users, meaning they use multiple times per week or per month. That shows that it can be a viable transportation option for low-income families and individuals. 11% responded as owning 0 cars, 34% 1 car, 55% 2 car households. And the map on you see at the right is distribution of those who responded to the survey in Minneapolis zip codes. We collected complaint data via 311, direct email, and phone call. There were 85 complaints received over the course of the 4-month pilot, 46 parking complaints. Those could have been anything from a scooter blocking the pedestrian path of travel, to blocking access to a doorway or a building, to somebody essentially just didn't want to see scooters in front of their property. 35 riding complaints where that spanned anything from riding on the sidewalk, riding the wrong way down a bike lane, or some other conflict in terms of how a scooter is ridden. There were 4 damaged scooter complaints. Of the complaints that we received, 3 were submitted by those identifying as having a disability. There were 4 reported crashes involving scooters with no severe injuries reported in any of those cases, and 9 reported near misses involving scooters. The map on the right is the map of complaints that we received via 311 that had a location tied to them. So in conclusion, in evaluating the 2018 pilot, Public Works has developed the following conclusions. Scooters did contribute to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled. As I mentioned previously, 42% of survey respondents stated that they use a personal vehicle, TNC, or taxi less often with access to scooters. Safety and accessibility for all who interact with scooters was a primary concern and still remains a primary concern. Equitable access was lacking, both in geographic distribution of scooters as well as the awareness and understanding of low-income pricing and alternative access options that both companies provided, so those who didn't have a smartphone or bank account could still use them. There's very little engagement done by either company on that front. Prosperity, so scooters provided an additional option to access education and jobs. 56% of respondents stated they used scooters to commute to work multiple times per month or week. Mobility, 62% of respondents to the survey stated that they use scooters multiple times per month or week, again, reemphasizing the point that scooters were not just novelty, they were a meaningful transportation option. And with regard to active partnerships, Public Works collaborated with over 40 partners in development and evaluation of the 2018 pilot, as well as developing and benchmarking 2019 recommendations. And that includes city departments and divisions, peer cities, public agencies, advocacy groups, and vendors themselves. And so thinking about 2019 and recommendations that Public Works is bringing forward, we would ask to renew and extend the initial pilot for a 1-year term through March of 2020. At least 2, but no more than 4 participants in the pilot, vendors participating in the pilot. Interested vendors must submit an application to be considered, and that would include, among other things, safe riding and parking compliance plans, local education and outreach plan, scooter availability and distribution plan, and we would also require low-income pricing and alternative access programs of those who are selected to participate. It is Public Works' intention to limit the participants to those who fit best with our goals. We are no longer just accommodating for 2 companies. We can be selective about who we move forward with and how they fit into our goals. The intention is to include a strong focus on safety and equity in 2019. The application is intended to evaluate the vendors on a variety of topics, and as I mentioned, particular importance and weight will be placed on the local commitment. So we're interested in having vendors who are committed to establishing strong local engagement, neighborhood level outreach, as well as staffing, hiring and staffing at a local level, and those who are interested in really committing resources to their operations in Minneapolis. And that includes, as I mentioned, the engagement portion, both on safe riding and parking, as well as understanding and outreach on the low-income and access programs. And so, thinking about further details on the scooter proposal, or on the 2019 proposal, we would have minimum and maximum distribution requirements associated with that. That would mean at least 30% in areas of concentrated poverty, and not more than 40% in downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods. And with those, that we would establish an initial maximum of 2,000 scooters, which would be required to follow that distribution. And so at that number of 2,000, that would mean a minimum of 600 scooters placed in areas of concentrated poverty, and no more than 800 scooters in downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods. Thinking back on 2018, that actually represents an incremental increase we had roughly 400 to 600 scooters between the university and city pilots located in downtown and surrounding neighborhoods and in the Dinkytown area. And so it's a relatively incremental increase going from that 400 to 600 number to 800 at that cap. Public Works may increase or decrease the maximum number of scooters based on performance targets, and there would be a required fee of $100 per scooter. That would support oversight and regulation of the pilot, essentially allowing additional resources to be focused on that oversight portion from the city side, and then also support infrastructure improvements, so enabling us to start piloting things like dedicated scooter parking, potentially lane markings, additional lane markings where it makes it a little more clear that scooters can be ridden in bike lanes or where scooters should be ridden. And also the potential for enhancing additional bike infrastructure to really allow us to encourage and support good behavior, essentially, and help people be comfortable riding. For those who are new to the bikeway network, ensure that we're providing a safe and comfortable environment for them to be using scooters as well. The recommendations for the fleet size were developed based on a plan for much broader distribution, including a strong commitment to low-income, majority non-white neighborhoods in those areas of concentrated poverty. The maximum downtown is intended to limit the over-distribution and actually prevent over-distribution of scooters to the densest parts of the city, and represents an incremental increase considering the numbers and distribution of scooters last year. As was mentioned on the previous slide, the broader distribution will be supported through strong local engagement, including awareness of how to use scooters, safe riding and parking behavior, and awareness of the low-income and alternative access programs. One thing I didn't mention previously is that we would also ask both on the company side and on the city side to ensure that we get a lot more engagement on the vehicles that we have for ensuring feedback is received and heard. That includes additional resources dedicated to ensuring people understand 311 is an avenue to report feedback, both positive and negative. That we would add functionality through things like the C-Click Fix app to be able to incorporate potential pictures and a little more immediate engagement on 311 feedback, and also just generally having an understanding of how and where feedback can be reported. And in conclusion on the 2019 proposals, we would intend to evaluate the following: the impact on greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled, safety and accessibility for all who interact with scooters, how scooters exist as a viable transportation option for all in Minneapolis, scooters as a contributor to economic growth and ability to attract top talent in providing an additional option in our multimodal transportation system, how scooters are used to connect with transit and other modes, and what types of collaboration are key to long-term. In Minneapolis 2040, there's a goal to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050 and vehicle miles traveled by 38%. And that drives us to putting forward strong programs like this to be able to really support that and work towards that goal. I think the potential we saw in last year's program with a very limited pilot, very limited distribution, the number of people that were foregoing personal car trips, Uber and Lyft, and taxi trips was really encouraging and represents strong potential for moving forward with that climate action. And with that, I will close my presentation and stand for questions.
Thank you. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Johnson, for this presentation. Congratulations on finding a picture of a scooter driver using a helmet for this presentation. I think we can all agree that that was not the norm, and that's certainly been noted. And I've had a couple of neighbors repeat a rumor to me that I don't think is accurate, but I want to check with you that there's been a major uptick in injuries and emergency room visits related to this stuff, and there's a lot of people who expressed real concern about safety. What do we know about what the actual injury rate was, or what do we know about emergency room visits and what the safety implications have actually been with scooters?
Chair Wright, Councilmember Fletcher, thank you for that question. I did check with HCMC, and there were 2 reported visits attributed with scooters. The challenge is that in that scooter bucket, motor scooters, mopeds, and other kind of motorized bicycle type vehicles are considered, and neither Bird nor Lime was mentioned in any of that reporting. And so at this point, based on what was reported, we don't have any reporting from emergency room visits associated with scooters. I did mention there were the 4 reported crashes involving scooters, and beyond that, we have no other data suggesting, an uptick in injuries or scooter-related crashes. Now, certainly there could have been some that went unreported, and that's a possibility, and that's also a really important piece of what we would bring forward in 2019 is ensuring that people understand how and where they can provide that feedback or reporting if an incident does occur like that. But as far as what we see, it wasn't. There wasn't any sort of uptick in severe injuries. I would also contrast it with the Vision Zero report, which stated on average from the period of 2007 to 2015, there were 11 pedestrian traffic deaths and 84 severe injuries on average. And so comparing that with the alternative and kind of the alternative side of the safety message with relation to scooters, we're getting people out of cars and onto scooters, and which are inherently much safer than cars are, and we can help move the needle in our commitment towards Vision Zero as well.
Thank you. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I just want to thank you for lending your expertise to this, and I think that your experience in the private sector is a real asset to the city, so just want to thank you for all of the work that you're doing on this. I think nationally, Minneapolis has done a really good job of managing this transition to this new technology and new transportation option in our city, and I know it's partly because of your expertise and your networks nationally. One of my first question is about that. As you're talking to folks around the country in places that have more scooters or just more density, more people, I'm glad that to see scooters using our bicycle network, and I think it actually will help us make the case for the expansion of that important infrastructure. But I wonder if in places where it's more crowded, are we starting to see conflicts between faster moving scooters and slower moving bicyclists, and how do you see us managing that going forward?
Yeah, it is certainly a topic of conversation nationally. With regard to data, I guess the one place I would point to is Portland, which is what I've seen reporting on, and they had something like 41% of users that were scooter users that were essentially non-bike riders, and so similar numbers to us in terms of people who are new and potentially unfamiliar with biking, and so I think that's consistent. I would also say we are definitely, at least in terms of the 2018 pilot, we were very much on the conservative side. There are some cities like Austin, which started with 11,000 scooters and are now somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000. LA may be permitting up to 30,000 scooters this year. And so I think it's a little bit apples to oranges in terms of the fleet size that we saw and the potential interactions. One of the common messages nationally is being able to use kind of a broad spectrum of tools to be able to support and encourage good behavior and interaction in the bikeway network and more broadly in the right-of-way. And so using, to start with, that strong local commitment to education on how and where to ride scooters appropriately. We would then do our work Public Works would then establish some tools to be able to help support that, whether it's on the communication side or piloting, as I mentioned, some infrastructure improvements to help encourage people understand this is how I park, this is where I ride, and ensure that kind of first interaction is a good one and really supports, okay, I understand that I should be riding in the bike lane, I should be parking in either the furnishing zone, or if we establish dedicated parking in those areas, and kind of doing our work to re-emphasize the existing kind of education and outreach that was done. And then from there, if you see other people doing it, you're more likely to do it yourself. And so building that density of users that are, again, interacting appropriately in the right of way, that, it's kind of a virtuous cycle of we then, get new users feeling more comfortable in seeing other people doing it. And in addition, those who are biking or, otherwise using either the bike lanes or on the sidewalk are able to also see that, understand the expectations for how scooters should be parked and ridden, and again, feel more comfortable interacting with them.
Thank you. I just have two more things. The first is that, I think this is the right approach, the way that you've described how we've landed at how to roll this out in our city, and maybe being a little more conservative in the early years so that we can watch people's behavior and really encourage the way we want this to work in our city. I am mindful, though, of not, overly capping scooter use. And I represent Ward 10, so I think it's worth saying that my constituents sometimes ask, well, when are we going to start capping how many cars we allow in our city if this is the approach that we're going to take to alternative modes of transportation? So, I take that to heart, and I'm watching carefully as we go through the years of the pilot to see, to make sure that we're staying in that sweet spot. And I think that your recommendation is solid and will help us make sure that if and when we do want to significantly increase, we'll be ready and people will have that knowledge of our network, and we'll just have time to have gotten used to our system. So I appreciate that thoughtfulness. And then the last thing I want to say is I just want to note, I don't think that this is the particular area where it's actually the most concerning, but I do have some concerns in general about labor standards within companies who are operating in our right-of-way. I think a lot of cities are starting to relook at their regulations related to Lyft and Uber from that lens, and that's where I think it probably has a greater impact in our, just in our worker standards arena. But I am mindful of that here too, and I think the other things that we've focused on in the licensing pilot make more sense. They're the most visible in our right-of-way, but I just want to note that for going forward, it's something I think we should be thinking about too, is how are we looking at the employment models and standards within new companies that are operating in our right-of-way.
Thank you.
Chair, Council President Bender, if I can just respond. I would say that in evaluating the application, one of the questions is going to be essentially your local hiring and staffing plan. And our approach this year is really going to be establishing strong local commitment, and that includes those who are doing the work on scooter companies' behalf. And so generally last year it was contractors who were doing that work and kind of following the gig economy, if you will. Our intention this year is to understand, again, with having more choice in terms of the companies that are interested in operating here, and providing also the fleet size that can allow them to commit more resources, and ensuring that requisite focus is placed on not only the kind of fleet and maintenance activities, but also the outreach and engagement piece as well. It may involve work with advocacy groups, but I have heard from a couple companies that said they could potentially commit resources to actual, on the ground, dedicated, essentially marketing and engagement efforts. And so that is going to be an important component of evaluating the companies who are interested in participating this year.
And just to be clear, my main concern was about what I understood to be a model of folks who are going to be charging vehicles and redistributing them, basically having to pay out up front to get the equipment that they need, and then being paid what may not be a minimum wage per hour compensation for their time because of the model that's being used for employment. And so just wanted to keep an eye on that and
Sure.
seeing how we understand that to meet or not our values around labor and employment.
Any other questions or comments for staff? Well, seeing none, I will just have to commend you for this report. It just provides with great clarity and concision the kind of data that actually brings to life our policies and guidance. We now have a very clear look of what has happened, and I think we've got really good data to guide how we want to move forward. It was just a really stellar report that helps us do what we're trying to do with this rollout, and I think it positions us extremely well. I think Council President Bender's comments about how we want to keep a sort of a broader look in terms of both modality and then what other communities are doing. I think you've definitely positioned us to have those lenses as well. And of course, it's just one more example of how Councilmember Fletcher's sort of keen sense of how we use data once again was definitely well reflected in your report as well, because a lot of this is all about data and management of it. So I just really commend this report. It was absolutely stellar, and thank you for it. With that, I will move to receive and file. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in
Mr. Chair?
favor? Yes.
This item is actually a motion to authorize the license agreement.
Well, very serious matter. We'll also receive and file the report and authorize the license agreement framework. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries, and we are now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.